Some towns vanish from the map, but their secrets never leave. In the forgotten hills of eastern Kentucky, where the pale dawn light spills like a silent witness over ridgelines older than the nation itself, there lies a true story so chilling it still echoes through the hollows, nearly 2 centuries later. This is no mere legend whispered around campfires. It's a documented account buried in hidden journals, true crime records, and fragments of chilling history that scholars, paranormal researchers, and true crime enthusiasts alike have been unable to fully explain. It's a tale where the boundaries between history and haunting grow so thin that even skeptics hesitate to dismiss what happened. In the autumn of 1834, a man named Reverend Ezekiel Morrison arrived at the isolated Baptist congregation of Pine Hollow, leading his 9-year-old twin daughters, Rebecca and Rachel, into a valley that time itself seemed to have abandoned. Pine Hollow was the kind of place so remote, so deep in the Appalachian wilds, that early maps barely acknowledged it existed at all, a settlement built by those seeking religious freedom, but guarded by secrets darker than any wilderness. What unfolded during the Morrison family's 3-day stay would become one of Kentucky's most unsolved mysteries, leaving behind haunting secrets and questions that have never found earthly answers. 2 children, mere girls with identical faces and eyes far too knowing, began revealing truths they had no way of knowing, hidden sins, dark pasts, and tragedies buried so deeply that even the guilty believed them safe. Yet every detail the twins spoke was later confirmed to be disturbingly accurate, turning Pine Hollow's sanctuary into a stage for one of the most terrifying true crime revelations in American frontier history. This is a story for those drawn to the shadows, for seekers of chilling history, unsolved mysteries, and supernatural knowledge that defies reason. Stay with us as we uncover a truth that most historians refuse to discuss, because sometimes the past isn't finished with us, and some secrets refuse to stay buried. It's not the ghosts we should fear. It's the secrets that still breathe beneath the soil. In the far reaches of eastern Kentucky, beyond the last dirt roads, where the Appalachians rise like ancient, slumbering beasts, lies a place so thoroughly swallowed by time that even the most detailed maps show nothing but blank wilderness. It's here, among ridgelines carved by centuries of wind and rain, that one of America's most unsettling unsolved mysteries waits, silent and unforgotten, a chilling true story hidden in the folds of forgotten history. The valleys are steep, shrouded each dawn in a white mist that curls through the timber like drifting spirits, and the air carries a weight as though every leaf and stone might be listening, keeping watch over secrets too heavy to speak aloud. Even locals, generations removed from the events, lower their voices when they mention Pine Hollow, as if afraid the hills themselves might overhear. This is a story not merely of ghost tales whispered beside a fire, but of documented facts that blur the lines between history and haunting, where the supernatural collides with hard evidence and leaves behind a puzzle that historians, paranormal researchers, and true crime investigators have tried and failed to solve. It's a story born from the rugged American frontier, drenched in faith, fear, and the relentless wilderness, a story that has become part of Appalachian legends, weaving its way into hidden secrets and the dark past revealed of Kentucky's early settlements. Some say the land remembers everything, and in these Kentucky hills, the land seemed to remember what the townsfolk tried desperately to forget, that in the fall of 1834 something arrived in Pine Hollow that would tear open wounds stitched shut for 16 long years, and expose truths buried deeper than the mountain roots. It was a man named Reverend Ezekiel Morrison and his 2 9-year-old daughters, Rebecca and Rachel, whose presence would forever stain the memory of Pine Hollow with an eerie glow of supernatural knowledge. They were not strangers to the mountains, but there was something in the way those identical little girls looked at people, as though reading secrets printed on the skin that made even the most God-fearing souls feel as though judgment was already upon them. This tale is for those drawn to the shadows, for seekers of chilling true stories, haunting secrets, and the unnerving suspicion that death is never truly the end. Because some places refuse to stay forgotten. And sometimes the dead aren't the ones who haunt us. It's the truth, demanding to be heard. Welcome to Pine Hollow, a town erased from the maps, but never from the echoes of its own sins. History doesn't whisper in places like Pine Hollow. It screams. In November of 1834, as the final russet leaves of autumn clung stubbornly to the branches, a tall, weather-beaten man with prematurely grey hair wound his way through the Appalachian wilderness, accompanied by two small figures who seemed almost to glide rather than walk beside him. His name was Reverend Ezekiel Morrison, and the two little girls at his side were his 9-year-old twin daughters, Rebecca and Rachel, identical in face but carrying a weight in their eyes that no child should ever have to bear. Together, they arrived at Pine Hollow, a settlement so isolated that even travelling preachers often skipped it on their circuit for fear of the treacherous mountain paths and the chilling rumours that seemed to coil around the place like mist. Yet it was this community that would become the stage for one of America's most chilling true crime stories. A story woven with supernatural knowledge and haunting secrets that would refuse to die. Reverend Morrison was no stranger to hardship. His reputation had travelled ahead of him through the winding trails of Kentucky and Tennessee. He was known as a man who brought spiritual renewal to remote congregations. A preacher whose sermons were said to shake even the most hardened sinners into repentance. Yet those who looked closer understood that the true mystery was never Ezekiel Morrison himself, but the twins who followed him wherever he went. These girls, barely tall enough to reach their father's waist, carried an eerie presence that seemed to unsettle even the most devout. There was something in the way they watched people silent, observant, as though measuring the shadows inside each person's soul. Some truths refuse to stay buried, and some eyes see far too much. As the family reached the edges of Pine Hollow, the sun was dipping low, casting long fingers of crimson light across the ridges, and a cold wind rattled the dry leaves, whispering secrets no human ears were meant to hear. Even the mountains seemed to lean in closer, as if eager to witness the storm that was coming. Pine Hollow was a place carved out of wilderness and desperation, founded by 3 families who fled denominational conflicts in larger towns in search of freedom, but who instead discovered that freedom sometimes comes with a price written in blood. By 1834, the settlement had barely 200 residents, all bound together by faith, fear, and an unspoken knowledge that some things were better left unspoken. It was the kind of place where news travelled on hushed voices and secrets seeped into the wood of the church walls like sap. It was into this fragile world that Ezekiel and his daughters stepped, bringing with them a sense of foreboding that no sermon could ease. They carried more than scripture in their satchel. They carried a key to unlock the buried sins of an entire town. And though their arrival seemed no different from countless other travelling preachers who had passed through Pine Hollow over the years, there was something about the Morrison family that set teeth on edge, something that made the hair on the back of your neck stand up even when you didn't know why. People whispered that strange events seemed to follow them, a pattern of confessions, reconciliations, and unexplained knowledge that left communities forever changed after the Morrisons departed. Because in places like Pine Hollow, the past never stays buried, and the price of silence is always paid, in blood or in truth. Sometimes the dead stay silent, but the truth never does. There's a peculiar silence in places like Pine Hollow, a hush that seems to hold its breath, as if the valleys themselves are waiting for someone to remember what was hidden there long before the roads were carved into the earth. It's the kind of silence that weighs on the chest, making you wonder if the wind carries voices you're not meant to hear. And when Reverend Ezekiel Morrison and his twin daughters, Rebecca and Rachel, stepped into that silence in November of 1834, it was as though something ancient stirred awake beneath the soil, sensing that its secrets were about to be exposed. Because Pine Hollow wasn't merely a dot on a map, it was a crucible where faith, fear, and guilt had simmered for 16 long years, forming a crust of polite smiles over a core of haunting secrets and unsolved mysteries that no one dared speak aloud. What the community didn't realize was that the Morrison twins were not just children. They were walking catalysts, harbingers of truths that refused to stay buried. People called Ezekiel a man of God, a preacher who brought spiritual revival wherever he traveled. But it was always the twins who left towns forever changed. Some claimed the girls possessed the second sight, a gift whispered about in old Appalachian legends, where certain souls were said to glimpse both the past and the shadows of what had yet to come. Others believed they were cursed, their eyes too sharp, too knowing, like mirrors reflecting sins no one wanted to see. And in Pine Hollow, there were sins so dark that even the trees seemed to lean away from the truth. By the time the Morrisons arrived, Pine Hollow was a place balanced on the edge of civilization and wilderness, barely 200 souls clinging to the valleys like ivy to old timber. Every man, woman, and child was bound together by the unspoken knowledge that survival depended on silence, that some stories were best left untold. But the Morrison twins had never learned the art of silence. They were children who spoke of things they should never have known, of tragedies older than they were, of hidden truths buried deeper than the foundations of the church they'd soon step inside. It wasn't just the supernatural that made people shudder. It was the realization that these girls might force them to confess secrets they'd sworn would die with them. Even as Ezekiel led his daughters through the narrow trails that twisted like veins through the hills, he knew that Pine Hollow would not escape unscathed. He'd seen it happen before, how the girls would innocently ask a question, or mention a name they shouldn't have known, and the entire world would shift. The past would bleed into the present, and things long dead would claw their way back to life. Ezekiel loved his daughters fiercely, but he also carried a haunted look, as though he bore the weight of knowing that every new place they visited might end in revelation, chaos, or ruin. Because while the twins' gift or curse had brought hope to some communities, it had left others in ashes, consumed by the fires of guilt and retribution. Some places are haunted by ghosts, Ezekiel once said, his voice quiet as mountain fog. But others are haunted by the truth. And in Pine Hollow, the truth was about to tear apart the fragile walls of secrecy that the community had built around itself like a fortress. Because when the Morrison twins finally spoke, the silence would shatter, and Pine Hollow would never be the same. The scariest thing in the world is realizing the world might not work the way we think it does. As Reverend Ezekiel Morrison and his twin daughters stepped over the threshold into Pine Hollow, the wind seemed to shift, carrying a sudden hush through the trees, as though the very forest paused to watch them arrive. The narrow trail they'd travelled disappeared behind them, swallowed by a wall of mist rolling down the mountainside, leaving them standing alone at the edge of a town that time itself appeared to have abandoned. The few lanterns glowing in cabin windows flickered, as if struggling to hold back a darkness older than the timber walls around them. And in that moment, Pine Hollow felt less like a settlement and more like a place suspended between worlds. A fragile pocket where reality was beginning to fray. Pastor William Phillips had lived in Pine Hollow for 5 years. A man of scholarly habit who believed that everything could be explained if one simply collected enough facts. But when he saw the Morrison family approach under the dying glow of the November sunset, he felt something shift deep in his chest, a sense that this meeting was not coincidence but destiny. Some stories don't wait to be written. They write themselves in blood and secrets. Ezekiel's figure was lean and tall, his eyes reflecting the weight of countless miles and untold burdens. But it was the girls who captured every gaze. Rebecca's steps were light, her expression open and curious, while Rachel stayed half a pace behind, eyes lowered as though reading invisible words written across the dirt road. There was a stillness about them that felt older than childhood. Even the townsfolk who gathered to peer at the newcomers seemed caught between curiosity and something closer to fear. It was as if, without speaking a word, the twins broadcast an invisible signal that the ordinary rules of reality were about to break. Pine Hollow was accustomed to visitors, mostly travelling preachers bringing scripture and news from the outside world. But there was something different about this family, a silent gravity that seemed to draw the entire town into a single, collective shiver. Pastor Phillips watched as the Morrison trio neared the modest wooden church at the heart of the settlement. The way the twins' eyes swept across the buildings, as if recognizing secrets hidden in the grain of the wood, made him want to look away and stare closer all at once. The town was quiet as the pastor stepped forward to greet them, extending the kind of cautious welcome that frontier life demanded. But even as he offered hospitality, he sensed that the real visitors were not simply standing before him in flesh and blood. It was as though Pine Hollow was about to be visited by revelations waiting for centuries to be spoken. In the hush that followed polite introductions, Pastor Phillips felt the weight of countless eyes watching from the darkened windows. He knew, with a chill certainty, that Pine Hollow was standing on the brink of something monumental. Something that might rip open the fabric of everything they believed about faith, morality, and the safety of secrets. Because the Morrison twins didn't just arrive in Pine Hollow, they arrived to expose it. And in that moment, Pastor Phillips felt the first true doubt of his entire ministry, a whisper in his mind that maybe reality itself was about to come undone. It's terrifying to realize the universe might be far bigger and far stranger than we've ever believed. As the last notes of evening prayer faded into silence, Pastor Phillips led the Morrison family into his modest cabin, a structure built from rough-hewn logs that creaked under every gust of wind. Inside, the flickering lamplight cast restless shadows along the walls, and the air smelled faintly of wood smoke and damp wool. It should have been an ordinary night, like countless others he'd spent welcoming travellers from the dusty trails. But the presence of these newcomers twisted the air tight, as though the room itself was straining to hear secrets waiting to be spoken. And deep in his bones, Pastor Phillips sensed that nothing about this encounter was ordinary. As the Morrisons settled at his table, Ezekiel thanked him in a voice low and roughened by years of sermons shouted over roaring rivers and howling winds. Yet even as he spoke, Pastor Phillips found his gaze drawn to the twins, who sat perfectly still, hands folded, eyes bright and watchful. Rebecca glanced around the room as though mapping invisible constellations, while Rachel's eyes seemed to slip through walls and into places no human gaze belonged. It was not simply the children's presence that unnerved him, but the feeling that they were somehow listening to conversations he had never spoken aloud. Dinner passed in uneasy quiet. The flicker of firelight played across Rebecca's face as she leaned forward and, with a voice bright as a bell, asked Mrs. Phillips a question so precise it froze every breath in the room. Did your roses by the east fence survive the blight from 3 summers ago? The question was like a blade slipped between the ribs. Mrs. Phillips dropped her spoon, staring at the child, colour draining from her cheeks. Because the rose blight had been her private heartbreak, known only to the closest neighbours, a sorrow she'd shared with no strangers. When pressed, Rebecca simply smiled and said she'd dreamed of roses while walking through the mountains. It was a statement so casual that, for a moment, Pastor Phillips almost believed it. Almost. But then Rachel lifted her gaze, eyes dark and unblinking, and whispered, "Dreams are just truths we haven't lived yet." And that sentence landed in the centre of the room like thunder, shaking loose the idea that the twins were merely children. Some truths refuse to stay buried, and sometimes the future comes knocking before you're ready to answer. The table fell into a hush, and Pastor Phillips found himself studying the girls with fresh dread. Were these merely children, blessed or cursed with uncanny intuition? Or were they, as the mountain legends warned, vessels for voices that belonged to the dead? The pastor realized with sudden, ice-cold certainty that the questions swirling in his mind were not merely academic. Because in Pine Hollow, the difference between coincidence and prophecy could mean the difference between salvation and ruin. As he cleared the dishes with trembling hands, Pastor Phillips felt the creeping certainty that this family had not come to Pine Hollow by chance. The quiet undercurrents of guilt, fear, and half-forgotten sins that flowed beneath the town's surface seemed suddenly closer to the light. He could almost hear the distant echoes of secrets clawing their way upward, demanding to be known, and in the glint of Rachel's eyes, he saw the reflection of a truth that chilled him to the marrow. Reality, as he knew it, was no longer safe. The greatest terror isn't what we don't know. It's discovering that the things we thought impossible were true all along. The dawn after their arrival came pale and thin, as though the sky itself were reluctant to witness what was about to unfold. Frost silvered the grass around the tiny cabin where the Morrison family had been offered shelter, and the air held that brittle chill that only comes in the high valleys of the Appalachians when winter is waiting just beyond the ridgelines. Inside the cabin, Pastor Phillips rose before the sun, driven by a restless energy that sleep could not soothe. He found Ezekiel Morrison already awake, sitting near the hearth where embers pulsed like a dying heartbeat, his Bible open but unread in his lap. There was a look on the preacher's face that suggested he was bracing for a storm he could neither predict nor prevent. When Phillips asked why he seemed troubled, Ezekiel spoke softly, voice edged with the weariness of a man who'd seen too many miracles turn to burdens. He said the girls had suffered disturbing dreams during the night, visions darker than usual, shadows moving through their sleep like silent predators. They often dream of the places we're called to. Ezekiel confessed, his eyes fixed on the glowing coals. But this time, it felt as though the place was dreaming them back. And there it was again, that subtle slippage between faith and fear. The suggestion that Pine Hollow was not simply a location on a map, but a living thing waiting for the Morrison twins to arrive. Because some places don't just hold secrets, they invite them. Before Phillips could speak, Rebecca appeared in the doorway, hair mussed from sleep, eyes sharp and too focused for a child her age. She looked directly at the pastor and said, in her clear, bright voice, "Pastor Phillips, under the 3rd floorboard from the altar, there's something hidden that shouldn't be there." The air seemed to collapse inward around those words. Phillips felt every drop of blood drain from his face as she continued. Rachel dreamed about it. And I dreamed about why it's hidden. Rachel slipped silently beside her sister. Her presence so soft it was almost like a thought forming in the room. Her voice was barely louder than the crackle of the embers as she whispered, "It's a brown bottle, wrapped in a piece of cloth that used to be a baby's blanket. A blue blanket. And in that moment, the cabin seemed impossibly small, the walls pressing inward, trapping Phillips in the heat of a truth he'd hidden even from himself. Because 3 months earlier, in a moment of weakness, he had indeed concealed a bottle of whiskey beneath the third floorboard from the altar, a bottle he had wrapped in a fragment of his dead infant son's blue blanket, a symbol of guilt he could not shake. No soul in Pine Hollow knew of it, not even his wife. And yet here it was, laid bare by the words of 2 children. Phillips felt his knees weaken, as though the weight of the entire congregation had fallen onto his shoulders. He realized, with bone-deep certainty, that the Morrison twins were not simply children with good instincts. They were something else entirely. It wasn't merely prophecy. It wasn't just supernatural knowledge. It was the sense that reality itself was porous, that the walls between past and present, hidden and seen, were thinner than he'd ever believed, and that these girls were moving freely through those walls, dragging secrets into daylight. Dreams are just truths that haven't happened yet, Rachel murmured again, sealing the moment with a line that would echo in Pastor Phillips's mind for the rest of his life. And as the wind howled across the valley outside, carrying the distant scent of pine and the taste of snow, he understood that Pine Hollow stood on the cusp of revelations that could tear it apart. Because sometimes, the only thing more terrifying than ghosts is the truth that refuses to stay hidden. There's nothing more dangerous than secrets clawing their way to the surface, and nothing more terrifying than realizing the walls that kept them hidden are about to collapse. By Sunday morning, a brittle frost lay over Pine Hollow, turning every branch into a dagger of ice, as if the valley itself braced for the violence of truth tearing through its silence. The congregation gathered inside the modest wooden church, each person clutching their own sins like hidden knives. Ezekiel Morrison's sermon was fiery, his voice echoing against the wooden beams, calling for confession, for redemption, for salvation from the shadows lurking in every human soul. Yet it wasn't Ezekiel's words that would define that morning. It was the quiet footsteps of his daughters, moving between pews like pale ghosts. Because Pine Hollow was about to learn that the dead weren't the only ones haunting them. Rebecca stood before Samuel Turner, a prosperous farmer known for his generosity, for his pious facade. With eyes far too old for 9 years, she looked up at him and asked, "Mr. Turner, the money you've been taking from the church collection, it isn't stealing if you're going to put it back someday, is it?" The words cut through the church like a blade. Turner staggered as though struck, his face bleaching to parchment. He had indeed been skimming small amounts to cover debts from a failed investment, promising himself he'd return every penny once he recovered financially. But no one was supposed to know. And yet here was this child, pulling the hidden rot into the light. And Rebecca wasn't finished. She turned next to Martha Whitfield, the town's unofficial moral authority, and said, "Mrs. Whitfield, your husband didn't die in a farming accident, did he? He's still alive somewhere, and that's why you hide his letters." Martha gasped, nearly dropping to her knees. Her husband had disappeared 16 years earlier, abandoning her and their children, and she'd fabricated a tale of his accidental death to preserve her family's standing. The letters she still received from him in Missouri were a secret she thought would follow her to the grave. Panic rippled through the room like a physical force. Whispers rose, then fell into stunned silence, because the Morrison twins were moving methodically, each step unspooling the congregation's carefully woven lies. To Dr. Hayes, they spoke of patients who had died under his care, victims of his lack of proper medical training. To the Miller family, they whispered of the son hidden away in their attic, a boy with a gentle mind who had become their private shame. To young Thomas Brett, they laid bare his secret meetings with Elizabeth Carter, a married woman whose husband was often gone on business. Each revelation delivered in the same calm, childlike voice that made the horror somehow even sharper. It wasn't merely the facts that terrified Pine Hollow. It was the realization that nothing was safe, that walls meant to keep secrets weren't walls at all. They were paper, and the twins were the fire. People looked around the church with eyes full of suspicion and fear, wondering whose hidden sins would be the next to be dragged out into daylight. Pastor Phillips stood paralyzed behind the pulpit, gripping the wood so tightly his knuckles turned white, understanding that his congregation was unraveling before his eyes. The town was no longer merely a community of believers. It had become a stage for confession, judgment, and secrets too poisonous to stay buried. Because sometimes the true haunting isn't ghosts or shadows. It's the realization that the ones sitting beside you in the pews, the neighbors you trust, the faces you pray with, are all keeping secrets that could destroy everything. And in Pine Hollow, the past wasn't just knocking, it was kicking the door wide open. Some truths don't wait to be invited, Rebecca whispered. They come whether you're ready or not. The moment you realize the walls around your life are made of secrets is the moment you discover how easily they can collapse. As Rebecca and Rachel moved among the congregation, their small hands brushing the backs of pews, Pine Hollow seemed to shrink inward, every wooden plank of the church groaning under the weight of unsaid truths. Faces that had been friendly minutes earlier now stared at one another with naked suspicion. The town had become a fragile glass dome, one breath away from shattering under the force of revelations spilling out like blood from an open wound. Pastor Phillips felt it like a physical pressure pressing on his chest, the suffocating knowledge that the community he'd devoted himself to was unraveling strand by strand. Because when innocence wears the face of a child, no one is prepared for how sharp its truth can cut. Rebecca's voice, calm and bell clear, continued to slice through the hush. Not all lies are told with words, she said, looking directly at Mr. Alden, the blacksmith, whose powerful arms seemed suddenly small as he shifted in his seat. Some are told by silence. Mr. Alden blanched as Rachel leaned closer and whispered something too soft for the others to hear. Whatever she said made the colour drain entirely from his face, his lips parting in a silent gasp. The terror was not just in what was being exposed, it was in the understanding that the twins knew far more than they were saying. A wave of panic rippled across the pews. People shifted away from the twins as if they were a contagion, a truth virus, spreading secrets faster than any plague. The Miller woman pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders as Rachel murmured, "Your attic door creaks at night because someone is walking above your bedroom." Her husband's eyes went wide, horror dawning on his face, as though the truth he'd hidden so carefully had finally drawn breath. It wasn't just their shame anymore, it was everyone's business. And that was the most terrifying part, because Pine Hollow was no longer a sanctuary. It was a courtroom. Phillips tried to speak, to reclaim control of his congregation, but his voice faltered as Rebecca turned to him with a gaze so piercing he felt it drill straight into his soul. "Pastor," she said softly. The church isn't the only place hiding things beneath its floorboards. In that instant, Phillips realized he wasn't the only man carrying a private burden, and the knowledge almost brought him to his knees. Because secrets didn't just threaten reputations, they threatened the entire fabric of who people believed themselves to be. And for a preacher, that kind of doubt was a living nightmare. The sense of danger grew sharper, the atmosphere charged with something electric and lethal. Even the sunlight filtering through the high windows looked pale and sickly, as though it, too, was afraid of what was happening. Outside, a wind howled along the eaves, rattling the church's wooden walls as if demanding entry. It sounded like voices screaming through the gaps, or maybe it was only the guilt echoing off the congregation's collective conscience. Because in Pine Hollow, the ghosts weren't always the dead. They were the secrets everyone was trying to keep alive. Rebecca paused in the aisle, tilting her head as if listening to whispers no one else could hear. Some things buried in darkness don't stay there forever, she said. And in that moment, even the hardest men in the room felt a chill crawl up their spines. Because the realization was dawning, swift and merciless. These girls weren't simply uncovering secrets, they were exposing the dangerous fault lines beneath Pine Hollow itself. And once those cracks started, there was no telling how far the destruction would spread. The worst terror is realizing your faith can't protect you from the truth. A silence as thick as midnight filled Pine Hollow's church, as if the walls themselves were trying to hold back the tide of secrets threatening to drown the congregation. Pastor Phillips felt sweat bead on his brow, despite the chill seeping through the wooden boards beneath his feet. He had built his life on certainty, on faith, on the rock-solid belief that every question had an answer in scripture or reason. But as Rebecca and Rachel stepped toward the altar, he felt his entire understanding of reality start to fracture. Rebecca placed her small hand on the altar's worn wood, her fingers tracing the carvings left by generations of faithful hands. Her eyes, bright as glacier ice, locked onto Phillips's, and in a voice that seemed to echo from a place far beyond the church walls, she said, "This is sacred ground, but it's been stained by what happened here before." The congregation stiffened as if struck by a single invisible blow. Even the wind outside seemed to vanish, replaced by a suffocating stillness that pressed in on every soul in the room. Because what she was about to reveal would tear the heart from Pine Hollow's history. Rebecca's voice did not tremble as she continued. The Whitman family didn't die in a house fire. Pastor Phillips, they died right here, in this very room, and some of you know exactly why. The words hit like thunder cracking overhead. A sharp, collective gasp tore through the church. Pastor Phillips clutched the pulpit for balance, his world spinning as he tried to process what he'd just heard. For 16 years, the story had been the same. The Whitmans perished in a tragic fire, mourned and laid to rest. But Rebecca's accusation felt like a chisel splitting apart the stone of that lie, revealing something dark and pulsing beneath. From the back pew, Elder Thompson rose on shaking legs, the weight of decades hanging from his hunched shoulders. His voice cracked as he whispered, "Child, you speak of things that happened before you were born. How could you possibly know these things?" Rebecca turned to him, eyes blazing, her childish face transformed into something older, something eternal. "Because Faith Whitman told me." And hope showed Rachel the rest. The congregation recoiled as if struck. The mention of the twins who died all those years ago brought a chill like grave cold air sweeping through the church. Faith and Hope Whitman were supposed to be gone, buried and silent. But the Morrison twins were suggesting otherwise, that the dead were not finished speaking. Rebecca pressed on, detailing impossible facts: Faith's birthmark on her left shoulder, Hope's silver locket containing their mother's hair, the blue Sunday dress Faith wore the night she died, the nightgown Hope was still wearing from her sickbed. Each revelation chipped away at the congregation's collective sanity. These were details known only to a handful of people, and certainly not to children who'd been born years after the Whitmans were gone. It wasn't simply knowledge. It was evidence that the boundaries between the living and the dead were not as impermeable as they'd believed. Rachel, silent until now, stepped forward and said softly, "They came here for sanctuary, but they were found, and they were silenced." The words dropped into the church like stones into a deep well, sending ripples of horror through every soul. Pastor Phillips felt the ground sway beneath him, as though the earth itself was rejecting the truth being spoken. Because if the Whitmans had been murdered in God's house, then Pine Hollow wasn't just stained by sin, it was built upon it. And in that moment, a single horrifying realization dawned over the congregation: their faith might explain salvation. But it could not explain how two living children were speaking with the dead. And it could not save them from the truth waiting to be unearthed beneath their own church floorboards. There comes a moment when the human mind snaps, not from fear of the unknown, but from discovering that the unknown was real all along. As the echo of Rachel's last words faded into silence, the congregation of Pine Hollow sat frozen, every breath held as if a single exhale might shatter the fragile barrier between sanity and chaos. Pastor Phillips tried to speak, but no words came. His world, once built on verses and certainties, was collapsing under a truth so staggering that his faith couldn't hold its weight. Because the Morrison twins weren't just revealing hidden sins, they were dismantling the very foundation of reality. Rebecca turned to face Elder Thompson again, her eyes like twin shards of ice. "Faith said you were there," she said, her voice clear and cutting. "She said you held the lantern while they begged for their lives." Thompson's knees buckled, and he grabbed the edge of the pew, his gnarled hands white-knuckled with the effort of standing. The entire church seemed to close in, the air so heavy it pressed against every chest. The congregation stared at Thompson, a man they'd trusted for decades, now exposed as a possible accomplice to murder. And in that instant, Pine Hollow's moral universe inverted saints became sinners, and truth became the weapon that might destroy them all. Rebecca kept speaking, unblinking, unstoppable. She described the Whitmans fleeing to the church that night, seeking sanctuary from men who wanted them silenced. She described how Mary Whitman, heavily pregnant, clutched her daughters close behind the altar as voices shouted in the darkness. And then she spoke words no child should know. Faith said the church smelled like smoke and blood, and the floor was cold even when the fire was burning. The images her words conjured were so vivid that people flinched as if struck, some pressing hands to their mouths to stifle sobs. Because if the Whitmans had been killed inside the church, then every sermon, every hymn sung beneath that roof had taken place on a secret grave, and nothing could ever sanctify that blood-stained ground again. Rachel stepped forward, her voice soft but unyielding. They hid the bodies because the truth would have torn this town apart. Elder Thompson said it was for the greater good, but faith and hope, they never left. They're still waiting for someone to tell the truth. The horror was not just the murders themselves, but the implication that for 16 years, Pine Hollow had been haunted not by restless spirits, but by the weight of collective guilt. Pastor Phillips felt bile rise in his throat as he realized how many smiles, how many prayers had been offered over that hidden violence. The church had not merely been a house of worship, it had been a tomb. As murmurs rose among the congregation, the Morrison twins revealed even more impossible details. Rebecca spoke of Jacob Whitman discovering stolen money, blood-soaked coins, and the horses belonging to travellers who had vanished along the trails. She described how he had threatened to expose the truth, demanding restitution for the families of the murdered men. But Elder Thompson and others chose silence and murder. Rachel finished her sister's sentences, listing the names of missing travellers, describing how their possessions had been buried behind the church or hidden within the very mortar of the building's walls. Each name was a dagger driven deeper into the congregation's trembling faith. Pastor Phillips realized with a sick certainty that the church he loved was built on blood money, that its timber beams were nailed together not merely with sweat and sacrifice, but with stolen gold and silent screams. And he knew, as he looked into the Morrison twins' unblinking eyes, that the greatest horror wasn't the murders or the hidden graves. The greatest horror was that everything Pine Hollow believed about faith, morality, and community was a lie. And when truth arrived, wearing the face of two children, there was no sermon strong enough to drive it away. Because the dead weren't resting. They were speaking, and the living could no longer pretend not to hear. It's one thing to fear ghosts. It's another to realize the ghosts were right all along. The air inside the church was as still as death, each congregant straining to hear the next impossible word to fall from the lips of the Morrison twins. Pastor Phillips stood frozen at the pulpit, heart pounding so violently he thought it might burst from his chest. His faith was unraveling thread by thread, because the story unfolding before him was not simply one of murder. It was a revelation that the moral universe he trusted was rotten at its core. And worse still, the instruments of that revelation were two children who seemed to speak with the voices of the dead. Rebecca's eyes burned with an unnatural brightness as she turned toward Elder Thompson. "Faith showed me the place behind the church," she said, her voice ringing with a terrifying authority. "She said Marcus Webb's gold watch is buried there, along with the bag of money and the horse's bridle. Elder Thompson, you put it there after what happened on the trail." Thompson sagged as if the weight of decades had suddenly crushed him. Murmurs exploded through the church. Faces turned toward him, pale and horrified. Because Marcus Webb was a name that had slipped through Pine Hollow's past, like a shadow mentioned only in whispers. Another traveller who'd vanished on the mountain roads. Rachel spoke up next, her soft voice contrasting with the devastation her words unleashed. "The night, Mr. Webb died. The stars were hidden by clouds. You thought no one saw you, but faith and hope saw everything. They said you dragged Mr. Webb's body behind the church. You dropped his watch when you fell over a tree root. That's why there's a crack across the crystal." Her words were like knives flaying away every layer of secrecy. It was not simply knowledge, it was eyewitness testimony from beyond the grave. And as the congregation stared at the twins, realization crept like frost over their skin. The Morrison girls weren't guessing. They were remembering. Elder Thompson tried to speak, his voice choked with guilt and age. It wasn't supposed to happen. He gasped, tears sliding down his wrinkled cheeks. "We only meant to take the money, but Mr. Webb fought back. He wouldn't stay quiet. The dam broke inside him." He sobbed, shoulders shaking, as decades of buried shame erupted into daylight. The congregation watched a man they'd revered crumble before their eyes, his confession destroying the last fragile hope that Pine Hollow's sins were merely rumour. Rebecca tilted her head, her voice suddenly soft and mournful. "Faith says you hear Mr. Webb's voice every night before you sleep. He asks you why you left him there, why you took his watch." Elder Thompson let out a low, keening sound, collapsing into a pew, because the twins had touched the one place no man can shield his private nightmares. And there was no coming back from a revelation like that. Phillips felt his mind quaking as he tried to process the flood of confessions. If what the twins said was true, and every shred of evidence screamed that it was then Pine Hollow had been built on blood. The money that raised its church, its homes, even its roads, came from men murdered for gold, men who'd vanished into the mountains and were whispered about in old Appalachian legends as restless spirits. Rachel lifted her gaze again, her voice barely above a whisper. "And there were others," she said. "Mr. Thompson said it would only happen once, but then it happened again. And again, the weight of that admission landed like an iron anvil. Because now the congregation understood this was not an isolated crime. It was systematic. It was the very blueprint of Pine Hollow's existence. Pastor Phillips gripped the edge of the pulpit, sweat dripping from his brow, feeling as though he were hanging over an abyss. Everything he believed in faith, morality, the sanctity of the church was crashing down under the monstrous truth revealed by two girls who seemed to see into the very marrow of history. He looked into their eyes and saw not innocence, but the reflection of every sin Pine Hollow had tried to bury. And in that moment, he understood the most terrifying reality of all. Sometimes, the dead don't stay silent, because the living don't deserve peace. The true horror isn't that monsters exist. It's realizing they were the people you trusted all along. As Elder Thompson collapsed into the pew, sobbing under the weight of his own confession, a hush fell over Pine Hollow's church, so profound that even the wind seemed afraid to intrude. The Morrison twins stood side by side, their small frames dwarfed by the heavy wooden beams towering above them. Yet somehow, in that moment, they were the tallest figures in the room. Because they weren't merely children, they were judges, executioners, and the conduits through which impossible truths had chosen to speak. Rebecca turned slowly, scanning the congregation, her eyes locking onto faces that suddenly refused to meet hers. "Faith and hope aren't the only ones who whisper to us," she said, her voice soft but charged with the power to crack open the world. "There are others, so many others." A ripple of shudders moved across the pews as Rachel stepped forward, continuing the revelation. Some were travelers who disappeared along the mountain roads. Some were neighbors. Some were children. Her words were soft, yet each syllable dropped like a stone into the silence, sending ripples of horror across the assembled crowd. Pastor Phillips felt as though he were drowning in an ocean of revelations. The twins spoke of the hidden foundations of Pine Hollow, of how the very timber of the church was paid for with gold stolen from murdered travelers. They spoke of community leaders who orchestrated killings, then buried their guilt under hymns and prayers. And with each new detail, Phillips felt his faith fracture further, until it seemed to him that God himself had turned his face away from this cursed valley. Because if the church was built on blood, then every prayer uttered beneath its roof was a prayer offered over a grave. Rebecca's eyes glistened as she described the children who had come before her, and Rachel children who, like them, seemed able to glimpse truths others could not. But instead of being embraced, they were labelled possessed, hidden away, or vanished under suspicious circumstances. Faith said there were others like us. Rebecca continued, her voice trembling only slightly. but they were silenced. Because people fear what they can't explain. The congregation recoiled as one, as though struck by an unseen hand. Because this revelation was not merely about Pine Hollow. It was about the monstrous possibility that the entire region might be littered with forgotten graves and silenced seers. Rachel whispered a name none had heard in decades, Samuel Collins, a preacher who vanished while travelling the same roads Ezekiel Morrison now walked. She described his horse, a bay mare with a white star on her forehead, and the gold coins he carried sewn into his saddle. Her words matched perfectly with old records Pastor Phillips recalled only vaguely from the church's earliest ledgers. The realization hit him like a physical blow. The twins were not simply recounting rumours. They were revealing precise, verifiable facts about murders that even the authorities had left unsolved. Elder Thompson lifted his tear-streaked face, voice shaking as he choked out, We thought we were protecting the town. We thought God would forgive us if we built something good from all the blood." But Rebecca shook her head, eyes suddenly hard. "God doesn't bless what's built on murder. He sends voices to remind you that truth refuses to stay buried." The congregation stared at the twins as though seeing them for the first time as beings both innocent and terrifying. Childlike, yet cosmic. The embodiment of the idea that justice sometimes wears the face of those too young to carry its burden. Pastor Phillips felt the walls of the church pressing inward, as if the building itself were recoiling from the weight of its hidden history. He knew, with a certainty sharper than any sermon he'd ever preached, that Pine Hollow would never again be able to pretend, because the dead were speaking, and now the living would have to decide whether to listen or continue building their lives on the bones beneath their feet. "Some truths," Rachel whispered, "are louder than any lie you try to bury. There comes a point where the truth becomes so monstrous that even faith can't save you from it." Pastor Phillips's mind felt as if it was splitting open under the weight of too many revelations, each one more harrowing than the last. The church, once his refuge, now seemed a cage of timber and guilt, each board echoing with secrets that refused to die. The Morrison twins stood at the front, impossibly small, yet commanding the entire room, with a presence that felt almost supernatural. Because it was no longer merely about Pine Hollow. It was about the terrifying possibility that reality itself was built on hidden sins. Rebecca took a step forward, her eyes glimmering like wet glass under the flickering lantern light. "Faith showed me the night Jacob Whitman confronted the elders," she said, her voice low but clear as crystal. "He demanded they confess. He said he would ride to Lexington and tell the authorities everything." A shiver ran through the congregation as she paused, letting the silence stretch until it felt like a noose, tightening around every throat. But Elder Thompson told him it was too late, because too many men had blood on their hands. Rachel continued without missing a beat. Faith and hope heard the arguing. They saw the elders force Jacob and Mary Whitman to stay. They watched the men drag them behind the altar. They heard the children crying until there was only silence. Her words dropped into the hush like stones into black water, sending ripples of horror across every face. Even the oil lamps seemed to dim, as if recoiling from the images being conjured into existence. Because the twins weren't just telling a story, they were reliving it. Rebecca's voice took on a brittle edge as she recounted details no living person should know: the precise placement of each elder around the sanctuary, the smell of sweat and gunpowder, the prayers murmured in shaking voices as the final shots were fired. "They tried to burn the evidence," she said, "but blood soaks into wood, and no matter how many times they scrubbed the floor, the stains came back." A gasp rippled through the church as several older congregants glanced instinctively toward the floor beneath their feet. because it was no longer just an accusation, it was the revelation that they'd been kneeling in prayer over a hidden grave for 16 years. Rachel lifted her eyes, her voice trembling only slightly. Faith said the spirits wouldn't rest because they were buried in the place they died, mixed into the very mortar of the church walls. Her words seemed to warp the air itself, as though the church were groaning under the weight of the ghosts it had tried to contain. Pastor Phillips felt his knees go weak, gripping the pulpit so hard the wood bit into his palms. Because this wasn't merely murder, it was the desecration of sacred ground. Elder Thompson, face wet with tears, tried to speak but could only manage a strangled whisper. Rebecca turned to him, voice soft but merciless. Faith wants you to tell the truth about the babies, Mr. Thompson. About Mary Whitman carrying twins. About how they died with her that night. The words exploded through the church like a cannon blast. A collective moan rose from the pews as the congregation reeled under the weight of this final, monstrous truth. Because if Mary had been pregnant, then the murders were not 4 lives taken, but 6. 2 unborn children erased before they'd even drawn breath. Rachel stepped closer to Elder Thompson, her small hand raised as though delivering a blessing or a sentence. Faith says the babies cry sometimes, even now. She hears them in the walls. The sound of muffled sobs filled the church. Pastor Phillips felt a sob tear free from his chest as the last pieces of his faith crumbled into dust. Because the idea that the church itself might be haunted not merely by ghosts, but by the souls of murdered infants, was a horror too great for any theology to contain. And in that moment, Pine Hollow was forever changed. Because the Morrison twins had not merely revealed hidden crimes, they had ripped open the very seams of reality. And once you see the truth behind the curtain, no amount of prayer can make you unsee it. Sometimes the truth doesn't set you free. Sometimes it chains you to a memory you can never escape. The morning after the Morrison twins' revelations dawned pale and silent over Pine Hollow, as if the sun itself were hesitant to rise on a town forever changed. Frost glittered like shards of glass across rooftops and the church's wooden steps, and even the birds seemed reluctant to break the hush that hung over the valley. Inside the church, the wooden pews sat empty save for a few scattered hymnals, lying as though dropped in flight. The building felt like a crime scene and a tomb all at once. Because in Pine Hollow, faith and fear were no longer separate things, they were now hopelessly entangled. Pastor Phillips stood alone at the pulpit, staring at the place where the Morrison twins had stood just hours earlier. Their voices still seemed to echo between the rafters, as though the very wood remembered every word they'd spoken. His mind churned with the images the girls had painted, blood on the altar, children hiding in shadows, secrets pressed into the bones of the church itself. He felt as though every sermon he'd ever preached had been delivered over a grave, every prayer uttered into a void. Because how do you continue to lead a flock when the ground beneath your feet is soaked in innocent blood? Outside, townspeople wandered the muddy lanes of Pine Hollow like ghosts themselves. Families avoided one another's eyes. Neighbours who'd shared Sunday meals for decades now crossed the street rather than speak. A deep, corrosive suspicion hung over every conversation, a silent question in every glance. What secrets are you hiding? Because the Morrison twins had ripped open wounds that could never truly heal. Truth, once unleashed, becomes a thing with teeth. Rebecca and Rachel were gone, leaving as quietly as they had arrived, vanishing down the winding trails into the Appalachian wilderness. Yet their presence lingered like a chill no fire could warm. People whispered that the church was cursed, that every plank was steeped in the voices of the dead, that the twins had pulled the veil back on something that could never again be covered. For some, it was proof of divine justice. For others, it was evidence that reality itself was far more fragile and far more terrifying than anyone wanted to believe. Phillips found himself questioning not just his ministry, but the very shape of existence. If two children could speak with the murdered, what else lay hidden beyond the edges of human perception? How many other towns held churches built on secrets? How many prayers were whispered into rafters that listened and remembered in Pine Hollow? No hymn would ever sound the same again. Every note carried an undertone of sorrow, a resonance of truth that refused to be silenced. Because the dead were no longer resting, they were speaking. And the living had no choice but to listen. And so, as dawn bled pale light into the frost-bitten valley, Pastor Phillips closed his eyes and whispered the only prayer he could still believe. In Lord, grant us the courage to face the truth, even if it destroys us. Some echoes never fade. They just wait for silence so they can be heard again. The aftermath of the Morrison twins' revelations didn't simply end with Elder Thompson's confession or the shovels digging behind the church. It seeped into every breath of Pine Hollow, like a silent poison. In the days that followed, the valley felt suspended between two worlds, a place caught in the lingering twilight between what people once believed was true, and the monstrous reality they could no longer ignore. Because Pine Hollow had become more than a town, it had become a haunted story. Pastor Phillips found himself unable to sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the Morrison twins standing beneath the wooden cross, their eyes reflecting truths too ancient and too cruel for children to bear. He heard their soft voices repeating the names of the dead over and over, until those names felt carved into his bones. Each night, the wind outside the parsonage seemed to carry faint whispers, as though Faith and Hope Whitman were still trying to speak. And for the first time in his ministry, Phillips wondered if the wind was whispering the truth. Across Pine Hollow, the church doors remained closed. The congregation avoided even looking at the steeple that had once been a symbol of hope, because they all knew now that the steeple was just another piece of wood soaked in secrets and blood. Neighbours spoke in hushed tones about how they'd seen Elder Thompson staring at nothing, whispering apologies to invisible children, about how Mrs. Whitfield had burned every letter from her absent husband, as if hoping to scorch the past out of existence. But no flame was hot enough to burn away the memory of what they'd learned. Rebecca and Rachel Morrison were gone, swallowed by the Appalachian trails. But their absence was almost more haunting than their presence had been, because they'd left behind not merely answers, but questions that would never find peace. Who else might have vanished along those twisting mountain paths? How many other churches hid blood in their floorboards? And how far did the Morrison twins' knowledge truly reach? Phillips found himself imagining the twins in other towns, revealing other buried horrors, forever pulling skeletons into the daylight. At night, the valley lay wrapped in a suffocating hush. The moonlight fell across the church windows, revealing faint reddish stains that no amount of scrubbing seemed able to erase. Some said it was only a trick of the light, while others whispered that it was blood, reappearing again and again, because the church had become a vessel for secrets too powerful to stay buried. And in Pine Hollow, secrets were no longer just words. They were living things, waiting in the dark for someone brave enough to hear them. Phillips stood many nights in the cemetery, staring at the uneven ground where they'd found bones beneath the church. The names carved on the gravestones felt suddenly insufficient, as if the truth required more than stone to contain it. He wondered if the spirits of Marcus Webb, Samuel Collins, and the Whitman family still lingered among the gravestones, or if they were finally at rest because two 9-year-old girls had spoken the words they'd waited 16 years to hear. But he doubted peace would come so easily, because in the silence that fell over Pine Hollow, there was a new sound, an echo that carried the Morrison twins' voices into every corner of the valley. And no one who heard it could ever again pretend that the past was truly past. Phillips knew the town would survive, because towns always do, but it would survive differently. The smiles would be thinner, the eyes more wary, because the line between faith and fear had forever blurred. And Pine Hollow would never again be a place where secrets stayed buried. And in the deepest hours of night, Pastor Phillips would sometimes find himself whispering the same words over and over, like a prayer. Some truths are louder than silence, and once you hear them, you can never go back. Some truths don't haunt you because they're frightening. They haunt you because they force you to wonder how much of your own life was built on lies. In the weeks that followed the Morrison twins' departure, Pine Hollow seemed to exist in a suspended state, like a town holding its breath, waiting to see whether the earth beneath it would finally collapse. The leaves fell in drifts of gold and rust, but instead of celebrating the beauty of autumn, the townspeople moved like shadows among the trees, eyes darting nervously as if expecting ghosts to step out from behind every trunk. Because now they all knew that ghosts weren't pale spirits drifting through graveyards. They were memories and secrets and crimes that refused to stay dead. Pastor Phillips felt it most keenly. Each time he climbed the steps to the empty pulpit, he felt the weight of invisible eyes upon him. The sanctuary smelled faintly of damp earth and old wood, but beneath it all, there was something sharper, the metallic tang of blood, or perhaps only the phantom memory of it. His voice, once steady as the church bell, now trembled as he spoke, because every word felt like it was balanced on the edge of a blade. Because what sermon could he possibly preach that would cleanse this place of its sins? Rumours spread through Pine Hollow like wildfire, each one darker than the last. Some claimed the Morrison twins had been angels sent to punish the town for its hypocrisy. Others whispered that they were witches, cursed to wander from place to place, dragging people's secrets into the light. A few dared to believe the truth was simpler and far more terrifying, that the twins were merely human children, cursed with a supernatural knowledge that no human mind should ever carry. And in every whispered speculation lay one unspoken terror. If the Morrison twins knew these truths about Pine Hollow, what might they know about the rest of the world? Children refused to sleep alone. Parents bolted attic doors and checked closets twice before blowing out the lanterns. The woods that had once seemed peaceful now felt sinister, each rustle of leaves a reminder that the forest might still be watching, remembering the blood spilled among its roots. The congregation avoided the church, some out of guilt, others because they were convinced that at night they heard small voices echoing under the floorboards, whispering secrets too horrible to repeat. And that was perhaps the cruelest consequence of all, that the church had become not a sanctuary, but a monument to guilt. Phillips struggled nightly with questions that scraped against his soul. Did God truly send the Morrison twins to reveal these horrors? Or had something darker chosen them as its mouthpiece? He feared there was no comfort in either answer, because either way, it meant that the barrier between the living and the dead was far thinner than he'd ever believed, and that some knowledge came at a price too high for any mortal to pay. And he couldn't shake the conviction that Pine Hollow was only the beginning. because hidden in the girl's final words had been a warning. Rebecca's voice, echoing in Phillips's memory, rang as clear as a bell. The nightmares didn't stop here. There are other places, other churches, other secrets waiting for someone to hear them. And that single sentence was a blade that cut deeper than any confession. It meant Pine Hollow wasn't unique. It was just the first domino to fall. At night, Phillips found himself walking among the gravestones behind the church, his lantern casting wavering light across the worn names. He sometimes thought he saw two small figures standing at the forest's edge, watching him silently. But when he blinked, they were gone. Yet the feeling remained, the sense that the Morrison twins were still there somehow, unseen, carrying the secrets of the dead and waiting for the next town whose lies demanded to be unearthed. Because the dead had spoken once. And in Pine Hollow, no one could ever again believe that silence meant peace. Some ghosts haunt places, others haunt the mind, but the worst ghosts of all are the truths we try to bury. The 4th week after the Morrison twins left, Pine Hollow existed in a state of uneasy quiet, as if the town itself was holding its breath, afraid of what might happen if it dared exhale. The autumn air grew colder, and fog coiled through the streets like pale fingers reaching for secrets still hidden. The church bell remained silent, its iron tongue rusted into stillness, because no one could bring themselves to call the people back into a house that felt more like a crypt. And in every house, behind every shuttered window, the same question pulsed like a second heartbeat. If the twins were right about this, what else might they be right about? Pastor Phillips spent his days in restless motion, moving from one end of the village to the other, stopping to speak with people who couldn't meet his eyes. Each conversation was punctuated by long silences, as though words were too fragile to carry the weight of what they'd all witnessed. Because the Morrison twins hadn't just revealed crimes, they detonated a truth bomb that tore the floor out from under reality itself. And now the entire town was stumbling through the rubble, unsure of where to step next. Some claimed they saw the twins lingering on the edge of the woods at twilight, their silhouettes half hidden among the trees, eyes glowing faintly like foxfire. Others swore they heard the faint murmur of children's voices rising from beneath the church floorboards, whispering secrets in a language older than English. Even skeptics began to avoid walking past the church at night, unwilling to risk catching sight of ghostly faces peering out between the boards. Because in Pine Hollow, even the shadows had begun to feel like witnesses. Phillips found himself questioning the entire framework of his faith. What good were prayers when the ground you prayed upon was soaked with blood? What comfort was scripture when innocent lives were slaughtered under a roof meant to shelter salvation? He replayed the Morrison twins' voices in his mind, over and over, until they became the soundtrack of his waking hours. Faith's name, whispered like a lament, hope's laughter, echoing off stained glass that now seemed to weep crimson in the sun. The past wasn't dead, it was roaring back to life, demanding to be heard. Across the village, normal routines dissolved into paranoia. The blacksmith hammered fewer horseshoes, his eyes darting to the forest as though expecting the twins to step out with new revelations. Mothers pulled children close, hushing their questions about ghosts and bloodstains. Farmers who once traded gossip at the well now drew water in silence, each lost in private calculations of how many secrets might still remain hidden. Because Pine Hollow had learned a brutal truth: once secrets start speaking, they don't know how to stop. At night, Pastor Phillips would stand alone outside the church, staring up at the steeple that no longer rang. He wondered if the church itself was alive somehow, listening, remembering, aching to confess the horrors its walls had witnessed. And in the cold wind, he sometimes heard a soft, childish voice say, "There are other places, Pastor, other towns, other truths waiting to be seen." It left him shivering, not from the cold, but from the conviction that the Morrison twins were only the beginning, that the veil between this world and whatever lay beyond had been forever torn open, and some things, once seen, can never be unseen. And in Pine Hollow, one truth remained louder than any hymn or prayer: the dead don't stay silent, and the past always finds a way to speak. History doesn't just live in old books. It lives in the walls. It waits in the silence. And sometimes it speaks through the mouths of children. As November winds howled down the mountain passes, Pine Hollow seemed to shrink into itself, the town's edges dissolving into grey mist that rolled through the streets like a silent tide. There were days when the sun barely rose, leaving the valley caught in a half-light that felt more dream than day. People whispered that Pine Hollow was cursed, that once the Morrison twins pulled back the veil, the town slipped into some liminal space where the dead and the living coexisted. And the longer the silence stretched, the more everyone feared what else might be waiting to speak. Pastor Phillips felt the weight of each sunrise like a judgment. The hymns he tried to practice in the empty church came out cracked and hollow, as though the air refused to carry words of salvation. Because how do you sing of grace when the pews you sing to were built over blood, his faith, once the iron spine of his life, now felt brittle as old parchment? Each prayer seemed to die before it reached the rafters, as if the very walls were rejecting absolution. And in those silent moments, he wondered whether Pine Hollow had become a place God himself could not look upon. Rumours continued to swirl. Some said the Morrison twins had been seen near Devil's Creek, staring into its black water as though communing with unseen voices. Others claimed they'd passed through nearby towns, leaving behind the same trail of exposed secrets and shattered lives. Because if the twins carried forbidden knowledge, then perhaps Pine Hollow was only the first chapter in a much larger, darker story. And that possibility was more terrifying than any ghost story ever told among the Appalachian hills. Children lay awake at night, trembling under quilts as floorboards creaked and wind moaned through the eaves. Parents tried to soothe them with gentle lies, insisting there were no ghosts, no secrets, nothing hiding under the church floor. But the children knew better, because they'd heard Rebecca's voice, calm and clear, saying some truths are louder than silence, and no amount of gentle words could ever erase the echoes of that sentence. Because once you've heard the voices of the dead, the world never sounds quiet again. Phillips found himself haunted by visions not just of the Wittman family, but of all the others whose names the twins had spoken, the travellers, the missing children, the unborn twins whose souls seemed to hover like candle flames around the church. He wondered if every community had its own hidden ledger of blood and secrets, waiting for someone like the Morrison twins to come along and read it aloud. And he feared the day when those children might return, eyes shining with the weight of impossible truths, ready to speak the next chapter of horrors. Because there was a deeper terror hiding beneath every revelation, the possibility that the Morrison twins weren't unique. That somewhere out there, other children were dreaming of secrets no one should know. And if that was true, then the entire world was a tinderbox, waiting for the spark of forbidden knowledge to set it ablaze. Pine Hollow's nightmare might be the prologue to something far more devastating, a slow unravelling of all the lies that kept civilization from collapsing under the weight of its own sins. And so the town huddled deeper into silence, afraid to ask questions, terrified of the answers. But Phillips knew the silence was a lie, Because truth doesn't vanish just because you refuse to speak it. It waits, it festers, it grows teeth, and someday it demands to be heard. And as he stood beneath the steeple that no longer rang, Pastor Phillips whispered into the cold air, "Some secrets don't rest in peace. They rest in wait. Sometimes the scariest truth is simply this: the past is never really past. It's only waiting for someone brave enough to dig it up." So as the echoes of Pine Hollow fade into the mists of Appalachia, we're left with questions that scrape against the edges of sanity. Could there be other towns like Pine Hollow, hiding secrets beneath pews and prayer books? Are there more voices waiting for anyone to finally listen? Or is the Morrison twins' story a chilling reminder that no place, however holy, is safe from the shadows cast by human choices? But here's what matters. We can't let fear keep us silent, because secrets thrive in darkness, but truth demands the light. Now I want to know what you believe. Do you think the Morrison twins were touched by something supernatural? Or were they simply victims of a truth too big for any child to carry? Drop your theories in the comments below. Your perspective might be the key that unlocks the next chapter of this chilling true story. And if these stories of haunting secrets, unsolved mysteries, and dark pasts revealed keep you awake at night, make sure you hit subscribe, save this video for later, and turn on that notification bell. Because here, we uncover the truths that refuse to stay buried. Until next time, remember, some echoes fade, but the truth always finds its voice.